This talk was delivered by Conservation Architect Fergal McNamara, who is leading a multidisciplinary team preparing a conservation management plan for Belvedere House, Gardens and Park.
Specialties to bear trying to understand the domain. And all of us, I suppose, are coming to it a little bit fresh, and having, I suppose, visited here over the years, but also not being involved in the day-to-day. And a big part of our job is to speak to the people who work here, the people who manage it, and then the people who visit. And this is a great opportunity to kind of have a discussion about its future. And I suppose essentially, we come to it fresh eyes, but also we're also spending a lot of time looking at what people have written about the place before. And this is Arthur Young, and he was a very well-respected writer on agricultural issues in the 18th century. He wrote a very famous book about his tour in Ireland, which contains a lot of information about the landscape and how it was, how people lived in the landscape at the time, and how they made a living from it. And he also wrote a very famous book about France, and wrote a lot extensively on Britain. And so he's a very useful source, and he wrote this about Belvedere, and it's very apt, I think, for this place, that there's greater, more magnificent scenes are often met with, but none where a more beautiful or a more singular one. So it's very kind of sets what's quite special about Belvedere is that you have this landscape, and by the standards of the time, it's a relatively small domain, sort of like a domain in miniature, and then also with a kind of a toy house, but obviously at a kind of scale that it's still impressive. A lot of you will be familiar with the story of Robert Rochford, the first Earl of Belvedere, and how he came to build the house. But I'll just go back a little bit and just talk about the structure of what we do. So we're preparing what's called a conservation management plan, and that's sort of a worldwide standard for historic places, gardens, landscapes, houses, anything you can think of really to do with heritage. And they all usually, following this particular guidance, follow from trying to understand the place in the first place, and that involves background research, then trying to understand the place as it is now in terms of looking at what we call historic fabric, which are, its walls, the buildings themselves, the gardens, their condition. So that's all written up and understood. And then there's a statement of significance, which is very important, where you're trying to distill everything, all the different aspects of the place that are of cultural significance, and I suppose looking at it in terms of qualitative and quantitative criteria that involve its architectural, archaeological, historical, social significance, ecological significance, all these things, and how this becomes a whole. And that comes from, in the earlier first charters, from the Ecologists charters, they first started focusing on the monument, which is sort of very much the building. And then they started to broaden the interest in terms of the landscape, but also the cultural heritage of the people who enjoy the landscape or has meaning for them. And then we start to break it down into having understood the landscape and the place, what the challenges and opportunities of the place, or the vulnerabilities, its threats. And then we start to, so what we've been doing is aside from walking around this stage, that's the basic management stage. We've been doing a lot of background research, like in the Irish Architecture Archive, and some lead to dead ends, and some are very helpful for us. These are photographs of the, just as you come into the house before, so in the 1960s, there's quite a lot of photographs for the Country Life magazine, and this is all very helpful for us in doing our work, trying to understand the value of the place and how it came to be. And we also have the benefit here, John Smith, who's in charge of the horticultural school was able to point us to previous reports that were done by Terence Smith and Belinda Jupp and Thomas Mackerling in the late 90s. And that's excellent background for us. And so really we see what we're doing is trying to bring that forward into the current decade or century, but also trying to learn lessons for what they were doing then, and seeing how many boxes were ticked. And it was great to see that a lot of the objectives they set out there have been implemented and done very well indeed. And this is also when we're working this, we're trying to get a sense of the time scale. And here we've got a kind of just illustrating how the house and the gardens developed over the last 3 centuries or so. And the story of Robert Rochford and his wife, and also Richard Cassells, his architect. And then there's another interesting character we don't know too much about, is Thomas Valentine, who may have been the first gardener. And then Thomas Wright, who would have been, seems to have been the designer of the grottos, the follies, and the jealous wall, the arch and the grotto, and the gazebo, and then looking at views and photographs of the estate. That's another indicator of how important it is, just how often it's been recorded in antiquarian prints and historic photographs. And then moving into the Victorian era, where we have Charles Brinsley Marley inherits, and he spends it like most of the rest of the next century and into the rest of the century in the house, and he came up with lots of different ideas. But just again, stepping back, Robert Rochford would have been undertaking what's called a grand tour, where young men would travel Europe and having a look at art of the Renaissance and antiquity as part of their education. And while there, they would have encountered scenes like this. This is Nicolas Poussin's view of Tivoli near Rome, and this is a lot of 17th century landscape art was very influential into the 18th century, and then became part of landscape garden design. Whereas during this period, this painting was painted, landscape gardening around large houses and castles was very geometric and regimented, and this just kind of speaks to a sort of an increased awareness and appreciation for natural landscapes, but also having buildings within the landscape, and kind of having a romantic idea about ruins and antiquity, but also looking at the natural features and making the best of those. And that started in Britain and specifically England, a new kind of naturalistic style of gardening for the large estates. And Belvedere is interesting. First of all, it's quite an early garden of this sort in the Irish context, so dating after 1740, when the house was built. And the house was built and designed by Richard Cassells, who was one of the most prolific and celebrated architects of the Palladian style in the 18th century. German-born, but spent most of his mature to an English family, but spent most of his mature working life in Ireland, and in that he was very prolific. Other buildings by Castle include Leinster House and the Langham Hospital Rotunda, just Carton House. So if his the list of houses, and he also this is Belvedere House, and this is a view by Jonathan Fisher from I think 1790s, 1796, and this is Tudenham House, also designed by Richard Cassells. This is a nice stage where the estate would maybe be 50 or so years old, so it started to mature. And this is the gazebo, the octagonal gazebo with the roof and the jealous wall, and then obviously the rustic arch would be behind that. But what's so important is that this house has such a presence, but it's actually a scale at the standard of the time of someone of his rank. This is intended as a sporting lodge. It's a type of house that's really just for the lord or the owner, the landowner, to have parties or take holidays. Their main estate was a Gauls town about 5 miles southwest of here, and this is where this was built, was at the stage where his marriage broke down, and we have the story of the wicked Earl and all that happened at the time. So he took residence, this would be his main residence in Westmeath, but he was also prominent in Britain as well, so we would have had another kind of lifestyle. This is where he would have come for his holidays, and they would have enjoyed hunting and fishing and also walking around the landscape. And this is just some of the kind of the background research you're looking at. What's interesting, this is an overlay that Claire McDonald did of the Down survey map, so from the 17th century, of Lough Ennell, which they're saying there, Hannell there, but also with the boundaries of the townland boundaries locally. So we have this one here, which is Rahan, and we have this is the wood of Lynn. So we'll see now in a bit how essentially the estate straddles both those boundaries with the stream passing through the middle. And here, if you can just about see that, you'll see what it says there: shrub, stony and mossy underwood of Lynn, Lynn is up here in the corner, along a much more established seat. So when Robert Rochford was coming to the estate, he wasn't, a lot of these domain landscapes are based around the already well-established seat of the family. So there might already have been a tower house, there might already have been a house from the 17th century on the site. Whereas here in Belvedere, as far as we can tell, there was no major, it was really essentially designed around this house and this landscape in a very new style, and something that, so just to adorn and to make the owner look powerful and special, and something for them to enjoy the lake and all that so over time, this is the Rochford domain, so his brother George developed his seat there, so he wasn't, so that was Tudenham, and then over time with a number of different domains passed through the family in different generations. And this is another overlay. You have this, just kind of following landscape on this side. The down survey turning things a little bit on its head, just to kind of give a sense also of how important the lake is to the estate. This is the Ordnance Survey map of 1840 or so, and that's the best kind of earliest record really of the domain landscape that we have other than the views. But what shows, even at that stage, this overlay on a current aerial photograph, it shows how much of you can see that actually when you're looking at the tree cover, you can see pretty much that the shape of the plant, the landscape, the woodland, follows very, very closely still today. So a lot of the main parkland relative to the house and then down to the lake is intact. A lot of the clumps remain the same, and the boundaries are well intact, except a very small few areas. But one important difference is that the levels of the lake have reduced by at least 2 meters in the intervening period, and this has kind of created changes along with its connection to lakeside, and we'll talk about that a little bit later also. And this is like an early photograph of the house, which shows it as it was intended. Again, you can see some of the trees that are alive then are quite as dominant as we have today, but also that you'll see that this is before the terraces were put in from the 80s, I think 1870s, 1880s, in 2 phases. And this is this stage, the landscape comes right up to the grassy banks come right up to the base of the house, and you just notice these. And this is how it looks in the 20th century, post 20th century, with the terraces added. and the diocletian windows kind of flattened with a flat arch, and a very kind of a more, I suppose, imposing impression really on the landscape instead of just being perched on the top of the on the hill. He would have lived in the house essentially, by himself. He was unmarried. We're very glad never were implemented. I should say that the house was itself extended slightly with a new bay at the back in the late 18th century, trying to make it more of a family house. It was really, essentially, is 2 bedrooms and 2 rooms, as it was designed by Cassells. They're beautiful rooms, but it's not. It's like a toy house, and so similar to the house of Casino Marino. It hasn't had a family, as it were, very often in its history that residing there. This is a landscape designed by Ninian Niven, who's a very well regarded 19th century landscape designer, for the terraces. So you can see that the terraces we see today are quite, unplanted except for kind of geometric hedging and the lovely yews kind of with their tulip shape. This is showing a sort of a more ambitious theme for the terraces. And this is a view. Sorry, the image is slightly. It doesn't really give it's just slightly off, which you can see it's just kind of on the vertical. But that's the house viewed from, we think, maybe either a boat or maybe just actually from the island out there, Goose Island. And sometimes there's a bit made about the fact that when you're walking around this stage, you don't necessarily, when you're walking down here, you don't really get to see this view very clearly because of the landform. But that's to it's a little bit misguided that it's very clear that the house was presented to the lake as much as to the paths from this distance, and was meant to have the lake as its main setting. And this is the view, this is another historic view towards that island, and the view of the house from over the terraces. That's from the Lawrence. So then, just to get on the different elements of the landscape, we have the Jealous Wall. This is photographed in the Irish Architectural Archive. And what's actually lovely about that, I mean, it's obviously intended as a sort of a screen of the farm buildings and perhaps Tuddenham House. But it's actually interesting to see how well preserved it is for something that's designed to look as if it's about to fall down in places. Something like that's very daring. Something those pinnacles, and that's something we have to look. But it's actually, this is a kind of a more romantic image than. Well, that's come up quite dark. But what we have today of it recently conserved, and just in the about say 20 years ago. And again, this is a little bit dark, but gives you a sense of what was actually in place. This is a really extraordinary structure and very, very special indeed, and very good state of preservation. This is the Thomas Wright's view of a design for a rustic arch, and you'll be familiar with this structure here. So there was perhaps a wider ambition for that. And then the other aspects of it, like the idea some of the very ancient trees, some of these might predate some of them might predate the house. I mean, I'm not an arborist or an expert, but that's something that kind of other another aspect of the domain that could be explored. These are these chestnuts that are up close to the rustic arch at that part of the estate, which do coincide with the Lynn wood that we see on the Down survey. And this again, just I suppose a view along the lake shore. Now again, the shoreline is further out into the lake than it had been originally. So originally they would have taken a walk along the lake shore, which would have had beech trees along the path, and they were looking between the trees out over the lake. Whereas today, the car landscape, I suppose the natural self-seeded landscape that's grown along the lake has kind of obscured those views along the walk. And this is just a view of the house as it is today. Just to point out that so there's a lot of work done here in the 90s and early 2000s to redo the roof and also window joinery and also to reinstate some of the character of the house, which included reinstalling dilatation windows. We'll get through some of the others here, also changes on the inside. This is just a nice aerial view of the house. So this, again, this is the later addition. So really, the castle had a much simpler building in mind, quite linear. Even though the photograph kind of pushes it vertical a bit, just sitting on the top. And it's really like a kind of, it's really designed for viewing. So towards the lake, towards the follies, over the landscape. And one of his main innovations in the Palladian style in Ireland was to have two bay windows on either side, projecting bays. And these were, designed to bring views out over the landscape. And a little bit, the effect is a little bit diluted again with the later extension. And inside the house we have beautiful decorative plasterwork by Cremillon, and it's considered some of the best examples of this period in Ireland. And obviously we have the wall garden. John Smith's here, and his team have done a beautiful job, and a beautiful job they've done over the years on the development and upkeep of the wall garden. And it's, of the ones that you visit, it's right up there, the very best. And this again is just the view down to the terraces. And I suppose it's just some of the things were introduced in the I suppose originally in the 19th and 20th centuries start to affect the intention of the house and how it's designed. I would say the placement of this U, how it affects the views out from the bay window. And these are things that I suppose require careful consideration about how to reinstate the meaning. So one thing I wanted to say about the design landscapes was that they were like extraordinarily ambitious works of art at the scale of a large domain, where they're trying to recreate these effects that you see in the landscape art for their enjoyment through planting and landscaping. A lot of this was done with spades, and simple carts, making huge interventions in the landscape. But Belvedere seems the one that the site might have been chosen because it already had a lot of these features. They didn't have to make a fake pond. They didn't have to make a new mound to put the house on. They didn't have to create this beautiful kind of sculpted valley ravine that runs the length. And this is just a view. Just this point I'm trying to make is, at the moment there's a nice sign placed here at that point where you can see the octagon and the rustic arch, and that's one to kind of show. And they're also showing the old surface of the drive. Stony surfaces left there exposed previously. But the shame of that is that, in a way, that's remote from the house, and originally the house would have enjoyed these views. But so over time, as the trees have matured in some cases, and then also, just in terms of management, these sort of opportunities have kind of fallen away, but can be brought back in certain circumstances, not in all. And these are just some of the. I know we have representatives today from Women's Shed. This is the old boathouse down by the lake, and that's got a lovely, between the house and the lake was the old, I suppose, little jetty or the harbour, and that would have been very important for all the boat activities on the lake and enjoyment. And this is the other half of what we're doing actually, is we're looking very carefully at the fabric of the house. it forms part of the CMP, but there also there's also grant funding that the Westmeath County Council obtained under the Historic Structures Fund, and looking at the condition of the roof that needs work, and then moving in. These precautionary measures are taken, so some of the ceilings, you might have noticed some of the rooms have been closed recently, and our hope is to be able to kind of start to address these issues in next year. We're starting our work on that already, and hopefully that some of these rooms will be available again for people to see and enjoy. It's part of that process over time. And then looking at some of the works that were done, David Skinner, he's like the Irish expert at historic wallpapers, was commissioned to do from fragments and careful testing in the house, was able to identify a number of different wallpapers, historic wallpapers, and he was able to obviously recreate those, and some of the rooms were furnished in that way. Some of the joinery, some of the beautiful oak joinery had been painted out, and that's something to consider when we're looking at the historic photographs as well. And then we're just start looking at the plasterwork. There's some areas of concern that we need to address as part of our work. These are the kind of photographs we're talking about from that kind of show as it was, and also some of it is instructive in terms of, you can see some of the same cracks today, and they aren't necessarily of concern. So we're just using, just looking at from first principles, seeing what opening up in areas and trying to find sources of water ingress and stress, structural stress. And this is the house. The joinery needs attention. Also, looking at the stairs and being able to open up the upper rooms as well. Kind of also showing again, I suppose, a bit of this, work that we done to open up the stairwell that involved removing 2 18th century rooms. You can still see their ceilings intact and left them in place here. This work had been, these are reinstated again in the 2000s, quite successfully, and then also we can just learning about the contents which were sold previous to the house, and some very special things, I suppose, left the house at that time, and just trying to understand those, and that's something that some of those pieces would be intrinsic to the cultural heritage of the house as well, just something to acknowledge and to understand as we do our work. And this is just some of our analysis, again, more of the overlays, trying to understand how the landscape works. It's interesting to say the purple there are the original planting areas, and then you can see this kind of green underneath is where the lake shore has been obscured, and the white there is kind of standing in for the changes in the I suppose the shoreline over that period of time. And this is just kind of a similar drawing, just looking again about what's been lost. So aside from just the lakeshore views, we have that large glade that are visible on the historic. Some of it is still visible today when you look at the different ages of the trees. And then some of these features of the 19th century, not to forget that the very precedent, say the rockery and the terraces, and what their potential is to, I suppose, in a way expand the value and interest of the estate, because the walled garden is very well established, but also it takes a lot of resources and time to keep it in that state. And these are just another, thinking about ways of changing maybe how the visitor centre works in terms of where people buy their tickets, how that whole relationship works, not necessarily to change things so much as just to review it and see how best practice elsewhere, and to see how things might be improved in terms of presentation. We have this as well, this long established entrance that brings you into the basement, and just looking about ways of approaching the house so people get the best experience, and also are guided in their approach around the house. not guided by people so much as how the different elements are presented to them. This is the ice house, which is hard to see. It's kind of under this mound here. Just, you know, the follies have a lot of work being done about them, like say the octagonal gazebo, carefully restored, I suppose about 20 years ago, or in that kind of time scale. There's not a lot to add there. The jealous wall, just a bit of maintenance really, and the same to a degree at the rustic arch. The ice house is one where, again, it's I suppose it's kind of closed really, but you have to kind of balance that with the concerns of, I suppose, the well-being of the tree, the very large tree that sits on top of it now. And I suppose this is just a kind of to finish up. It's interesting that, you know, we're looking at it from a different perspective. This is quite a nice map of the estate. That I think it was quite a good number of years ago, maybe 15 years ago. There was some initiative about, I suppose, visiting it. Like, you know, you have your fairy garden here, but this is something at a kind of a scale of the domain, and just, I suppose, it's a way of kind of engaging people of all ages and interests in the estate, just to be conscious of that. And having read some of the books, they've been very careful in terms of how they've kind of selected different parts of the estate to stand in for different parts of the stories. And these are just, I suppose, we're still working on these. We're just looking at potential areas to improve, and I've kind of grouped them here with the kind of colour code. But one's about kind of the landscape, those kind of works, and then there'll be conservation in relation to, say, the boathouse and jetty, the house, which is obviously the most complex one, and then the ice house, another one that could be you know, further explored. And then there's just kind of outlining things about future developments, maybe in relation to the visitor centre, maybe a more sustainable energy source for this estate, potentially like more permanent facilities for the horticultural school, and then also, I suppose, improving. There's already these nice beaches, and there's ways down, and there's benches, and there's, you know, some play appliances, and there's you know, the safety rings. But as you're walking through this really long walk, all the way down and around, just trying to look at different ways of, I suppose, adding a little bit more incident. And some of that's through landscape management, some of that's through, you know, paths, and just also maybe looking at some strategic little to allow people to experience the landscape in different ways, for different abilities, or different lengths of time. So that's enough of me talking, actually, sorry. And that's really where